What if everything you've been told about betrayal is wrong? What if I told you that the first betrayal didn't come from Lucifer, but from an ancient group of beings who stood before God long before Genesis? Imagine this. Lucifer, as we've been taught, isn't the first. What if he was simply continuing a pattern that started long before his rebellion ever took place? There are ancient texts, ones that the Bible left out, that hold the key to this mystery. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Apocalypse of Abraham. These texts speak of primordial beings who were created before the earth itself. They were not angels, not demons, but something in between. And when God revealed his grand plan to create mankind, they didn't raise their fists in defiance. They didn't rebel in fury. They withdrew, quietly, with contempt. Can you imagine it? The silence of their rejection was louder than any war cry. These beings, older than angels, filled with full consciousness, saw mankind as nothing more than dust unworthy, flawed beneath the divine. Instead of joining in creation, they simply turned their backs and walked away. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't a battle. It was a refusal, a withdrawal from the plan of God. Some ancient sources call this the separation of the firstborn. Others say it's when heaven first lost its unity. Lucifer's rebellion came after, but he didn't invent betrayal, he inherited it. What drove these beings to make such a choice? Why did they turn away from the Creator's plan for mankind? Could their silent rejection have been the true beginning of the cosmic war between heaven and earth? The Bible may not have included all the details, but the ancient texts, the ones left out, reveal a deeper layer of this forgotten truth. Comment 777 if you're ready to uncover the hidden stories behind the first betrayal, the truth about who these beings were, and why their rejection might have shaped everything that followed is about to unfold. Hold on. This is only the beginning. The first to betray God, before Genesis, not Lucifer. Long before the foundations of Genesis were laid, before the stars were hung, or the angels were summoned, there existed a creation few have ever heard of. Not of flesh, not even of spirit as we understand it. These were the first emanations, ancient presences born of light itself, yet untethered to the order that binds the heavens. According to fragments preserved in the forgotten corners of Enoch, whispered through the mystic layers of the Zohar, and hidden deep within the Chirogeneza, these beings were the primordials, not servants, not soldiers, not even messengers. They were consciousness, pure will, and radiant intellect existing as flame without fire, presence without form. Have you ever wondered what it means to exist before obedience was even a concept? Imagine a creation that knew no command, only being. The primordials were not designed to kneel. They were light with no instruction, thought with no task awareness, born before the law. Some ancient writings describe them as divine sparks, given full autonomy by the Eternal One, a test of purity, or perhaps the raw echo of God's first breath. They did not bow because they had never been asked to. They simply were. But then came the shift. God, in the boundless depths of his purpose, revealed something utterly unthinkable, a new creation formed not of light, but of dust, not emanation, but matter, and not merely animated clay, but a being in his image. That revelation cracked something in the cosmos. The primordials, who had known no hierarchy, suddenly saw a shape more favored than themselves, not higher in essence, but chosen by decree. From dust some whispered, and in his likeness. Can you feel the tension in that moment? If you were among them, would you not question too? An ancient midrash dares to peer into this mystery, describing a celestial council where divine awareness debated man's creation. Voices, if such things existed among the formless, offered warnings. Let not this creature be made. He will rebel. He will fall. They saw what would come, the betrayals, the bloodshed, the pride. Yet God, with sovereign clarity, made Adam anyway. He did not ask for agreement. He simply acted. And when he did something unprecedented, happened not a war in heaven, not a mutiny, but a silent refusal, a withdrawal. The primordials didn't curse. They didn't strike. They simply stepped back. In quiet defiance, they removed themselves from divine alignment. No storm, no fire, just an invisible rift, a fracture in intention. Have you ever stepped away from something not because you hated it, but because you could no longer accept it? What if they weren't rebelling but grieving? Jewish mystics would later call this moment the breaking of the intention. Others would refer to those beings as the blind watchers or the forgotten line, not because they lacked vision, but because they turned away from the light in solemn protest. Not with rage, but with sorrow. Kabbalistic texts speak of them being sealed, not punished, but paused. Locked in dimensions where time stands still, where even glory dares not reach. Not fallen, not condemned, simply absent. And now the question remains if they were the first to turn away before Lucifer, before Eden, before sin had a name. Then what does their story mean for us? Would you have stood with God? Or stepped back in silence? Among the ancient scrolls, preserved in the caves of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are fragile fragments that few dare to study closely. These writings whisper of spirits who dwell not in torment nor in rebellion, but in stillness. Beings who once stood so near the divine presence that they shimmered with its reflection, and yet now watch from a distance, not cast down, not condemned, but disconnected. Their essence remains, yet something vital is missing, like stars that once blazed with glory, but chose to stop burning. Have you ever seen light that refuses to shine? Can you imagine a presence so powerful, yet so silent? These spirits are not demons. They do not tempt or deceive, but they are not whole. Their silence was not passive, it bore the weight of a decision, a cosmic precedent. When they turned inward and away, heaven itself felt the tremor. For theirs was the first choice not to follow, not to submit, not to rebel, but simply to step back. And in doing so, they made space for something no creation had ever dared before disobedience without defiance. Lucifer's rebellion would shake the heavens like thunder. But the primordials, they moved like shadows, almost unnoticed. And that's precisely what makes their story so haunting. Because they proved a terrible truth that betrayal doesn't need a sword. Sometimes all it takes is silence, a whisper, a shift of alignment. And if heaven could fracture from a quiet turning away, if glory itself could be dimmed, not by hatred, but by hesitation, what does that mean for us? Have we misunderstood the nature of betrayal? Could it begin not with rage, but with a pause? God was not overthrown. His throne was never shaken, but he was abandoned. The first pain in heaven was not a battle cry. It was the soundless ache of rejection. No angels fell from the skies. No flames erupted. There was only that unseen severing, a quiet parting of paths by those who had once stood the closest to the throne of light. And it wasn't an act of violence. It was the absence of communion. And that absence, that silence, cut deeper than any war. Can you feel the ache of a creator whose own emanations chose distance over devotion, Jewish mystics describe this unfathomable moment with a phrase barely spoken. Oram nital mehem. The Elohim, their light was taken from them by God, but not their existence. They weren't destroyed. They were preserved, dimmed, like sacred lamps unplugged from purpose. Their flame still flickers, but only faintly hidden in places where divine glory no longer touches. This wasn't a sentence. It was a sorrow. They weren't judged. They were mourned. And now, you must ask yourself if the first betrayal of God wasn't rebellion, but withdrawal. How many today walk that same path without even knowing? Have you too ever stood so close to the light and yet started to drift away? For the first time in eternity, an eternity unmarred by conflict or distance, the Creator stood before a creation that no longer desired him. Not out of rebellion, not with rage, but with a quiet, devastating refusal. And that moment, though wordless, was the first rupture in the seamless flow of divine love. A fracture not in power, but in intimacy. Heaven until then had only known presence and response glory answering glory. But now something new had entered the divine story, a creation that turned away. An ancient commentary captures the trembling that followed. The angels' beings forged in obedience asked the question that echoed through the heavenly courts. Why would you create man, who will only sin? And God, with a resolve that chilled the cosmos, answered simply, "Even so I will make him." But the scrolls remain quiet on the deeper truth, whispered between the lines, an unspoken ache behind God's words. He did not create man in spite of that first abandonment. He created man because of it. Can you imagine a creator whose heart responds to rejection, not with wrath, but with a greater risk? The primordials, those first emanations, departed because they would not serve what they saw as beneath them. Dust, they said, was not worthy of the image of the Most High. How could the Eternal One wrap his likeness in weakness? In decay, they would not lower themselves to serve such fragility. And in their prideful withdrawal, they thought they ended the story. But God leaned into that very rejection. He didn't retreat. He expanded. He didn't erase the plan. He deepened it. He shaped man not as a substitute, but as a sacred risk. What if the next creation could choose to love not from instinct or glory, but from longing, from trust, from the silence of faith? Have you ever chosen someone when everything in you feared they might leave? Can love still be pure? If it's not guaranteed, God wanted a creation that could believe in him without seeing him, that could love him without being surrounded by eternal light. A creation that might walk through pain, doubt, and shadows and still turn back and say, "I trust you." He wanted devotion, not born from command, but from freedom. And that desire birthed not just humanity, but the entire mystery of Eden. Eden was never just a garden. It was God's answer to heartbreak. The first heartbreak in heaven wasn't caused by Lucifer. It began long before with beings who simply walked away. But God's response was not to destroy. It was to create again, but this time with risk embedded in the design. The risk of love without sight. The chance that someone you might stay even when you had every reason to leave. Have you ever felt like your existence was part of a greater healing? What if you were born to be the response to a wound no one on earth remembers, but heaven never forgot? And that's why the silence of those first traitors still lingers. Because though they stepped away, they still watch. From the edges of eternity, in places where light no longer reaches, something ancient observes. Still there, still silent, still judging. The first ones to turn away, now watching to see if you will do the same. Will you? And among those ancient ones, those who had once quietly turned away, there was one who refused to remain in the background. He would not simply withdraw. He would rise. Unlike the others who dissolved into the stillness, he burned with restless fire. Lucifer, the light-bearer, watched what the primordials had done in silence, but he would not follow their example. Where they faded into distance, he stepped forward, not with humility, but with defiance. He transformed their passive retreat into a calculated confrontation. They had withdrawn in quiet protest. But he would speak what they only dared to feel. What would drive a being of light to turn silence into strategy? Have you ever been so convinced of your righteousness that you challenged the very order that made you Lucifer wasn't the first to question God's design? But he was the first to weaponize that doubt. The Book of Enoch names him Hel-ben Shachar, son of the morning, not merely for his brilliance, but because of what he remembered. He had witnessed the first fracture. He had seen the pain in God's eyes when his creation stepped away. And deep within him, a conviction took root, not that man was holy, but that man was a mistake. He looked upon humanity not with wonder, but with suspicion, not as the image of the divine, but as a flaw carved into the sacred order. Lucifer's fall, contrary to popular belief, wasn't the result of a single moment of pride. It was the outcome of a long and building disagreement with the very blueprint of creation. He didn't reject a command, he rejected the plan. In a rare and cryptic passage from the Apocalypse of Abraham, it speaks of a shining one who stood before God and argued, should the throne not belong to those born of flame, not of clay? This wasn't rebellion born in the dark. It was a courtroom challenge. He did not sneak. He did not deceive, not at first. He approached the throne as a prosecutor. He saw himself not as an enemy, but as a guardian of order. The Zohar hints that Lucifer believed he was preserving holiness, that it was man, this vulnerable, fallible being, that would bring contamination to the eternal. In his mind, the cosmos needed defending from what he saw as divine vulnerability. He wasn't rebelling against God out of hatred. He believed he was helping God by opposing what he couldn't accept. But in trying to preserve what he thought was pure, Lucifer created the darkest distortion of all. Have you ever tried to fix something only to destroy it in the process? He turned the wound of heaven into an accusation. The quiet heartbreak of divine abandonment became the foundation for his revolt. He gave voice to the silence the primordials left behind. Where they walked away, he stood and shouted. Where they rejected gently, he tore through with fury. And for the first time since eternity began, heaven shook not from distance but from force. Not because someone left, but because someone tried to seize the center. But even in his rebellion, Lucifer was not original. He was responding to an ache he could never make peace with, a silence he could not accept. And when he fell, he did not fall alone. Have you ever considered who might be watching in silence, only waiting for someone bold enough to speak their hidden doubts? Behind Lucifer followed not armies of fire, but whispers of old. Not warriors, but watchers. Beings who had never raised a hand, but who had once refused to serve. And when they saw him rise, they recognized the echo. They saw the old debate, returning not about power, but about purpose. God was creating again, not more light but breath, not a radiant being but a fragile one, a creature of blood, of dust of longing, and not in the likeness of angels, but in the likeness of God himself. And so the watchers watched again, silent, solemn, uncertain. What would you have done, standing there in eternity's court? Would you defend God's choice, or would you see only the risk? This time, there would be no heavenly debate, no gathering of divine minds, no vote cast in celestial courts. The heavens, once consulted on creation's earliest decisions, now stood in silence. Genesis records it simply, "Let us make man in our image." But the ancient texts, those preserved in Midrash Zohar and Mystic Scroll, say much more. According to Midrash Tehillim, the angels cried out in protest as God began shaping Adam. They could not contain their confusion. "What is man that you are mindful of him?" they asked, echoing the cry of Psalm 8. How could dust deserve divine attention? How could the Eternal stoop so low? But God did not flinch. He did not offer explanation. He offered intention. The Zohar tells us that Adam was crafted from both the lowliness of dust and the breath of divine fire, a mixture so paradoxical it disarmed the accusers. Why? Because it created a being who could fall deeply yet rise even higher, a creature not limited by nearness to glory like the angels, one who would not serve out of reflex or radiant compulsion, but from choice, from longing, from love. Have you ever loved without guarantee followed, without seeing trusted without proof? That's what man was designed to do. And that made him not only dangerous, but revolutionary. He was not made to echo heaven, but to challenge it, to remind all who had walked away that God still believed in the power of risk. According to certain Kabbalistic traditions, Adam's creation wasn't merely a beautiful act of love. It was an act of war, a divine strike against the pride of the primordials, a holy declaration that dust, the very thing they rejected, could now carry what light refused. Can you imagine how heaven trembled, not at a rebellion, but at a birth man was not heaven's servant? He was its answer. A response to silence, to distance, to that cold severing long before Eden's gates ever opened. Not a puppet, but a partner, not made to praise blindly, but to seek the face of God and decide whether to follow. And that freedom, the raw, terrible beauty of it, made Eden far more than a garden. Eden became a battlefield, not of swords, but of ideologies, a sacred proving ground where heaven's oldest wounds were forced into light. It was there that divine love met ancestral bitterness. There that a new creation stood where the first ones refused. And right at the center, without even knowing it, stood Adam, flesh and breath, soil and spirit, a living contradiction placed in the crossfire of an invisible war he did not start but had to carry. Have you ever stepped into a battle you didn't choose just by being who you are? Adam was not just the beginning of mankind. He was the statement that God had not given up, that he had dared, despite abandonment, to begin again, to entrust his image to weakness, to wrap his likeness in limitation. And that act, so bold, so defiant, was an insult to those who had turned away. For they had once stood in undimmed glory, only to now see that glory handed to clay. And perhaps the question still lingers in the silence they left behind. If God would give such honor to dust, then what might he still be willing to do with you? Genesis chapter 3 begins not with warning nor with thunder, but with a voice already speaking. The serpent doesn't slither in with dramatic fanfare. There is no grand entrance. He is simply there. And his first words to Eve are deceptively casual. Did God really say? But make no mistake, this was not a question of curiosity. It was a calculated tactic, a seed disguised as conversation. From the very beginning, the serpent doesn't attack the command itself. He goes after something more fragile, more sacred. He targets the relationship, the bond between Eve and God, the unspoken trust between Eve and Adam, the unseen thread tying humanity to divine truth. Have you ever had someone ask you a question, not to seek the answer, but to make you doubt what you already knew? What most readers overlook is subtle, but devastating. The serpent's opening line wasn't a lie. Not yet. It was a distortion, a shift, a manipulation of framing. And in that slight twist, he created room for confusion. Scripture tells us in Genesis 2:17 that God gave the command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil directly to Adam. Eve had not been created yet. She received the truth secondhand through Adam's voice, not God's. And Lucifer, ancient and cunning, knew that. So he didn't need to argue with God. He needed to insert a question mark into Eve's trust. According to early Jewish midrashim, Eve added a line to God's original instruction when she replied to the serpent, "We must not eat it, nor even touch it." But God had never said they couldn't touch it. That addition, a subtle overcorrection, revealed something deeper, that the seed of distortion had already taken root. Why did the serpent go to Eve? Why not challenge Adam directly? Some ancient writings, including mystical threads from the Zohar, suggest it wasn't because Eve was weak, but because she was different. She represented something Adam did not: intuition, receptivity, an echo of spiritual sensitivity. She was not the lesser vessel, she was the mirror. And in that mirror, Lucifer saw an opportunity not to break the woman, but to shift the entire foundation of mankind through the one who perceived more deeply. Can you see how powerful that insight is? If you were Lucifer, would you not aim for the very structure through which divine design flowed? And that's why it worked. Not through force, not with flames or fangs, but through conversation, through the shaping of perception. Eve was not seduced in the way tradition often misrepresents. She was convinced. She reached for what she believed was wisdom. She acted not with rebellion, but with reasoning. And that's what made it so devastatingly effective. She reached, she touched, she tasted, and then she handed it to Adam. And what happened next? He did not question. He did not hesitate. He took and ate. And in that moment, the fracture that had once begun in heaven echoed now in the garden. Lucifer's strategy was never brute destruction. It was infiltration, a reworking of the blueprint from the inside. He didn't need to fight man with war. He needed man to dismantle himself. And he began not with rage, but with suggestion. And Eve, unaware, stepped into a conflict that had been smoldering long before she drew breath. She didn't cause it, but her choice became the hinge upon which history would swing. Have you ever felt like you inherited a war you didn't start, and yet your decision became the turning point? This was not just the fall of man. It was the continuation of an ancient tension between divine design and celestial descent. And now that conflict lived in flesh and breath and consequence. The silence that once fractured heaven did not stay there. It echoed soft but unrelenting into the fabric of earth. And when Adam and Eve stood beneath the trembling branches of Eden's forbidden tree, they stepped into a silence older than time itself. But unlike the first fracture, this one would not end in separation alone. Because even before the first breath of dust became life, the Creator had already written the answer into the very fabric of reality, not a plan for punishment, but a path for repair. Some ancient texts buried in mystical commentary, in seldom read scrolls, suggest that this world was never intended to be perfect. Not in the sense of flawlessness, but in the sense of purpose. Earth was designed as a restoration, a realm not just to house mankind, but to heal the breach left by the first turning away, a second chance. Not only for humanity, but perhaps even for the design itself. Have you ever wondered if creation itself is a response to a heartbreak no one remembers? This was never about domination, never about blind obedience. The power of man was not in perfection, but in choice. Existence became a divine invitation, not to serve as slaves, but to return as sons. Not to earn favor, but to rediscover alignment. Every breath you take, every moment time moves forward is a quiet reminder that the invitation still stands. It hasn't been revoked. And now, across ages of silence and shadows, a question remains, one that still pulses beneath scripture and myth. If the first betrayal came before Genesis, then who were they? Who were these immortals that turned from the light, not in war, but in refusal? Were they silent, rebels too proud to bend? Were they watchers assigned to observe and never act? Were they a forgotten lineage, lost in time, but not in consequence? What do you think? And so long before the fall in Eden, before the fruit was touched, or the serpent spoke, the true fracture had already begun. Not in defiance, but in silence. Not through violence, but through walking away. And from that ancient turning, a divine question has echoed across the ages. What will you do when you are given the freedom to choose? This story isn't just about forgotten beings in celestial realms. It's about us, about every moment when we feel the pull to step back from faith, from purpose, from truth. In your life, how many times have you felt the weight of silence, the temptation not to rebel, but to withdraw, to disconnect? This ancient story lives in our daily choices, in our struggles to trust what we cannot see, to love, even when it costs us something to stay, when leaving seems easier. But here is the hope. God didn't abandon His creation after betrayal. He created again. He didn't erase the story. He deepened it. And that means your failures are not the end. They're the soil for something new. You are not called to be perfect. You are called to choose, to return, to rise, to become the answer to what walked away. If this message stirred something in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. We also invite you to comment below. What do you think about these forgotten beings? Do you feel humanity was created in response to an ancient betrayal? We'd love to read your thoughts. Just type 777 if you're ready to return to the light and walk boldly in your divine purpose. And to those who've supported this channel through Super, thanks. Your kindness fuels everything we do. Whether you give or not, thank you from the depths of our hearts for being part of this journey. May you walk forward with courage. May you never forget who you are. And may the God who created you from dust breathe again through your destiny. Blessings upon you and your household always. We'll see you in the next video.